Hi, Liam O'Gogan here from liamogue.com. Today's video is one of a series in my ongoing research topic of Does It Matter? And today's topic is elements of a professional and an effective apology. And to contextualize this, one of the first quotations I'd like to look at is from Martin Luther King. And the quotation is, "Freedom is never given voluntarily by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." So I suppose underpinning the conversation that I'm having here is my learned experience that when it comes to the process of apologizing, particularly when it comes with two parties, the party who has the greater power, if they end up in a situation where they need to apologize, there are some difficulties around that, and I'd like to explore those. Again, I'd like the idea of putting some framework around the conversation, and the first of these, which is one I've used in another video but I'd like to revisit here, is a quotation from Confucius. And the quotation essentially has to do with accuracy in the use of language. And what he says here: if language is not correct, then what is said is not what is meant. If what is said is not what is meant, then what must be done remains undone. If this remains undone, morals and art will deteriorate. If justice goes astray, the people will stand about in helpless confusion. Hence there must be no arbitrariness in what is said. This matters above everything. And in fact, from my understanding, this is where the term confusion arose from originally. So again, essentially this breaks down for me as say what you mean and do what you say you're going to do. The second quotation I want to use as a backdrop for this conversation is this idea of the comparison between amateurism and professionalism. And I think it's very powerful when it says amateurs practice until they get it right, professionals practice until they can't get it wrong. So the context I'm going to discuss here is often around where you have a vulnerable or weaker amateur party who is challenging professional people in positions of power. And in the event of the weaker of those two parties actually being correct, where there's a disagreement, how the process of apology should take place in a professional and effective manner. So they're the two tenets that I'm going to operate under. I've done a lot of reading around this topic, and I've broken it down into 9 basic steps. So the first step I want to look at here, step number 1, very simple: accept responsibility for your actions. So if you're the wrongdoer, if you screwed up, admit it. Don't try to shirk your responsibility or shift the blame to someone else. Put your pride aside and own your own behavior. This first step is crucial to restoring trust with the person you offended. So the first thing you do is acknowledge that you are wrong and that you are at fault. No ifs or buts. Get to the point. No excuses. Having acknowledged that you've done the other party wrong, my suggestion is that you both seek clarification and agreement with the other side in describing exactly what you did wrong, so that everybody knows what exactly you're apologizing for. I think often we hear people at the point of conflict having an apology session where everybody walks away, and subsequently there's a lot of bitter feeling, particularly on the part of the person who was wronged, because they feel that the wrong that was visited upon them was never actually acknowledged and gone through. So to take time and spell out for the other person in an empathetic way, taking on board their understanding or their feeling about how you wronged them. Next one is, don't just apologize, say I'm sorry. Now, I think this is one of the most important difficulties around apologies. I hear it every day when I watch articles in court about a barrister or a solicitor apologizing to the injured party on behalf of their client. And I feel that's so really mealy-mouthed and fails to address what needs to be done in the process of an apology. If someone is going to take ownership of their misbehavior or their wrongdoing, I think it's really critical that they personally stand up, take ownership of this, and directly speak to the wronged party and say, I am sorry. I think it's very important here. Too often I hear people say, I'm sorry if you feel I hurt you, and posit that in some way as an apology, which is completely, as the legal brethren would say, disingenuous. A mealy-mouthed apology. And of course, ultimately in terms of healing wounds or moving on, I think it causes more difficulty than it solves. The next stage that follows, I think, from saying you're sorry is that this idea of asking forgiveness from the wronged party. And what that does is it sort of solidifies the idea of saying you're sorry, because you're now recognizing that it's not just a matter of me saying to you I'm sorry, that in order for that to make sense, I must acknowledge that you have the right to offer or to forgive me, or to withhold that from me. But that's something that you are not obligated to do just because I apologized. I think that's a critical element of a proper, professional and effective apology. The next thing is, if I'm the perpetrator of the wrong, I think it's critical that I listen to what the wronged party is seeking in reparation. Note, how can I make it right for you? Not so much what do I think is okay to give you as compensation in some way. Because often I would suggest that in many circumstances, persons who are wronged, that the fundamental thing they're looking for is an acknowledgement that they're not crazy, that you have actually wronged them. And secondly, that you're prepared to say you're sorry, and overwhelmingly, if you're willing to ask for forgiveness. I think those go a long way towards healing certainly the emotional hurt in terms of the wrongdoing. And in terms then of the wrong party seeking reparation, you're basically saying, well, look, how can I make this right? Show me what I need to do to correct this. So in that process, even the active listening, and to show that you're willing to listen with a sense of openness and integrity. Number 6 is be proactive and generous in agreeing what specifically you will do to record both the fact that you did the wrong and to correct any error. So again, this is about restating your recognition and acknowledgement of doing the wrong, but also the idea of undertaking that you're going to correct any error that may have occurred in the process, say damage to someone's reputation or whatever. Next, number 7 is commit to not repeating the behaviour that caused the error, and identify and deliver on specific reforms that you will implement to an agreed time frame to prevent future reoccurrence of this fault or error. Once again, in my experience, many people who have been victims of wrongdoing are not just thinking of themselves. Lots of situations where damage has occurred to them in their lives. Maybe they've lost family members through professional misconduct or medical negligence or whatever. And essentially what's driving them more than anything else is they do not want this to be visited in any other family. So this commitment to change, to acting in a way, to changing your processes and behaviours that this can never happen again, is a critical element in a professional apology process. And along with that, number 8, ensure that you deliver on any promises you make to the wrong party. I would think that one of the enduring frustrations that many people who feel wronged or who were wronged has been when promises are made and slowly but surely creepage kicks back in and bad practices re-deliver, or that people make promises and once the focus of the law or the public interest is gone off, they just go back into their own ways. So a critical element of a professional and effective apology is to make that second order change and to make sure you deliver on any of the promises that you make to make things better. And here's one I think is particularly of value, and because it's one thing satisfying the wronged person, making reparation to them, seeking their forgiveness, but it appears to me that part of the whole process of professional apology and an effective apology is not just to seek to get rid of the other person and get rid of the problem. If it is to have any meaning in terms of professionalism And once again, I want to go back to that quotation about professionalism, which we talked about, which is amateurs practice until they get it right. Professionals practice until they can't get it wrong. So it would seem to me that particularly when we're talking about professional people, people in a position of power, this element of atonement is critical. So what I suggest here is this: to create a learning item as an act of atonement, that act of making good. For example, planting a tree, sponsoring a public seat with a message on it, as a traceable reminder of your behaviour, or your previous bad behaviour, and as a note of warning for others to learn from. So that, we talk about learning from our mistakes, that this should never happen again. The sort of things that happen when we have seen world events like Auschwitz, etc., that we leave markers there for future generations to learn not to behave like this. I've set out those 9 steps towards what appears to me to be a professional and effective way of delivering an apology, very much in the context of another process that I'm going to make videos about, called the ISO-HALO process. And that process, it's a citizen-led campaign to rebuild public trust in not only politics but in all aspects of public life. And essentially, the idea is to establish as a core value the 7 principles, as we see here in ISO-HALO, of integrity, selflessness, objectivity, honesty, accountability, leadership, and openness, as ethical values that it would appear to me should reside in all our behaviours, but most specifically in the behaviours of leaders in society and those who are in powerful positions, people who are in well-respected professions, etc. And at the same time, I think it's important to bear in mind this concept of our humanity, and that once we realise that imperfect understanding is the human condition, there is no shame in being wrong, only in failing to correct our mistakes. And that's a quotation from George Soros, who certainly is not a poor man as a result of whatever mistakes he made. But I think this is very important, because when I've tried to discuss these concepts, both of principled ethics and the idea of perhaps seeking to have wrongdoing addressed by people in power, professionals, it's constantly turned around on me that, oh, you're trying to be perfect, who are you? And I think that's not the point at all. I persistently say that I fall 70 times 7 before I get out of bed in the morning, and even in trying to produce these videos, etc., I make spelling errors, etc., and I welcome all the time, as once again with these, that you may reflect on this video using the WWW process of what went wrong, what went well, and what would be better. And insofar as I have the energy and opportunity, I will do my utmost to try and correct any of these failings on my part. But again, in order that we build a society where we support and nurture these values of integrity, selflessness, objectivity, honesty, accountability, leadership, and openness, it's critical that we recognise that it's possible for people in every position. We can make mistakes. The important thing is, how do we respond when we make the mistake? Do we try and work around denial? Do we practice repudiation, obfuscation, passing the buck to someone else, giving mealy-mouthed apologies such as I feel sorry for the way you feel, as against I am responsible for doing some damage to you and I seek your forgiveness in that. Another quotation came to light there in my research, was from Confucius. If you make a mistake and do not correct it, this is called a mistake. And it appears to me that one of the failures, particularly of people in power, when it comes to procedural errors or mistakes, is that the failure to acknowledge and correct mistakes and make it right, often driven by either fear or fear of losing face, or belligerence, or a failure to understand the concept of noblesse oblige that goes with all positions of power. leaves society with the residue that the mistakes continue to be made, which is why, going back to the other conversation I had about atonement, is the process of atonement is beyond when you've just corrected it for the person you have wronged specifically, but that you do something extra, you leave something behind to make it better for all of us, and that you mark that space. Another one, which unfortunately is a problem that, again, I think people in a weaker position often have with those in power, that those in power tend to try and simply avoid the facts or hide the facts or have a paradigm blindness about the facts as they are. And just to remind you, facts do not cease to exist just because they are ignored. This is another quotation that came up in my research, which I thought is very powerful in this dialogue. It says, people acquire a particular quality by constantly acting in a particular way. A quotation from Aristotle, and it strikes me as this Kaizen or iterative improvement approach of creating a virtuous spiral, that the concept of creating what I call this culture of isohalo principles as being normalized in terms of the expectation of society as an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary process, in that it is by practicing on the small things. Like my mother would have said to me, look after the pennies and the pounds will look after themselves. Getting the detail right in small things and repeating good behavior will produce more good behavior. So that, you know, the objective of this 9-stage process, I said, of practicing or putting in place a professional and effective apology is about creating a better system. So if you see this in a customer service environment, instead of what I experience as the defensive, repudiational type of response by customer service personnel towards a challenge to their behavior, which leaves people, the customer, very unhappy. Recent research I'm doing on the medical affair shows that in Ireland, the Medical Council's own research shows that in 2006, only 5% of complainants about doctors and medical professionals felt that their complaints were properly addressed. That's only 1 in 20, which means 95% of actually people who were not happy with the outcomes of their complaints. There's really something fundamentally wrong there. Whereas, for example, if we went through the 9 stages I mentioned earlier, people would acquire a particular quality by constantly acting in a particular way. So if that's cleaning up their mess and doing it in a professional and effective way, then what you will recognize about their behavior is that it will fundamentally improve. And then this then to the consumer, the person who is making a complaint, perhaps the weaker in a party where you retain client services from professionals, is that the highest standard you will achieve is the lowest standard that you are prepared to accept. So again, drawn from the movie Thelma and Louise, that famous line, you get what you settle for. So a lot of people are afraid to demand quality processes. They're afraid to demand a professional apology. They're afraid to hold people fully accountable, because they just live in fear of people in power, and they lose sight of, if the facts are in your favour, then demand the highest standard and do not accept anything otherwise. The highest standard you will achieve will be the lowest standard that you're prepared to accept. So if you raise your standards of what you accept, the delivery of services will rise to meet that standard. Once again, another quotation which I think ties very well into both this aspect of going through a formal 9 steps of an apology process is a quotation by Henry Thoreau, the famous American writer who wrote the book Walden, where he says, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." And in Ireland in 2016, it's my impression, for example, in this process of the isohalo affair, where ultimately this campaign is about individuals, each individual voter downloading a form and requiring any candidate standing in the general election to make that personal private contract between me the voter and you the candidate, that you will uphold these standards of ethics in your public life, of integrity, selflessness, objectivity, honesty, accountability, leadership and openness. And that while it's a very small, apparently small step, it would appear to me this failure to adhere to these principles, and separately from that, the failure to have an honourable, a professional and effective apology process when errors are made, which we do as humans, that the failure to do those is really what Thoreau is talking about here, that so many of us ventilate at the branches of wrongdoing, whereas my suggestion is that what our focus needs to be in us root and branch change, starting from the bottom, inculcating these values of positive, of ethical behaviour, recognizing and challenging wrong when it's carried out, establishing the facts to determine what is the wrong, and then demanding that everybody goes through the process of acknowledging the wrong, making the proper apology, seeking the forgiveness, agreeing the basis on which the wrong was done with the victim of that wrongdoing, seeking to understand and meet the needs of for reparation, delivering on the promised change that you put into place, and then creating this learning product for future people through the process of atonement to make sure that other people don't do the same thing again. So as I wind down on this topic, a couple of infographics I came across in my research which I thought were interesting. This one here is interesting. I have made mistakes, but I have never made the mistake of claiming that I never made one. So I think that's very important, and no one, including and particularly me, I made lots of mistakes. The real issue is how I recognize and acknowledge them, to what I try and do to learn from those mistakes to prevent this happening again. Again, a reminder of one of those tenets in the 9 steps. Never ruin an apology with an excuse. There's nothing worse than a mealy-mouthed apology. I'm sorry for the way you're feeling about the way I've hurt you, if anything, rather than actually acknowledging the wrongdoing that you've done. A quotation there from Benjamin Franklin. Another infographic here which I suppose breaks down my 9 specific points into 3 parts. 1, I'm sorry. 2, it's my fault. And 3, what can I do to make it right? And a little underpinning there, most people forget the 3rd part. And just to bring us back down to earth, this little infographic on barriers to an effective apology. Embarrassment, loss of face, particularly in people in positions of power. They don't want to be seen to lose face, and partially because I think they see it as a weakness, that admitting wrongdoing or guilt is in some way going to weaken the integrity that they'll be seen to have, which I think is a complete misunderstanding of the basics of all learning, and also where you don't have a high trust society, I think that loss of face factor is very high. The other side of this is admission of guilt or legal responsibility. The way we've so perverted our legal processes and claim mentalities. If you're at a car crash, for example, and you're in the wrong, you're obligated by your own insurance people, don't ever admit liability. Or we see it happening in medical legal claims, which then of course lead to cost spiralling out of control. The other thing is an acknowledgement that went too far. Maybe I apologise too much for something I shouldn't do, which it goes back to that second point I made. If you're in the business of apologising, make it clear that you discuss with the person who you have wronged exactly what the error or wrongdoing or fault was. Get agreement by both sides, establish that as a fact, take ownership of what you've done. Don't take ownership of stuff that's not your responsibility. The next one is loss of power or one-upmanship. I suppose we live in an adversarial world, certainly when it comes to our legal processes, so dick measuring contests often seem to take over from the establishment of right, wrong, the ownership of misbehaviour or whatever. And of course I think this leads to a much less effective future for both sets of parties. It's very hard to build up a new working relationship with another party if the apology process wasn't properly gone through. The next one is a sign of weakness or fear of vulnerability. Again, this concept here that if you're seen to be weak by admitting that you're wrong, who will ever trust you again? And this other idea of fear of repetition, I'm not really sure where that is. Is it fear by you as the wrongdoer that you'll keep making the same behaviour again? Or is it the fear on the other party because you don't not make an effective apology that they don't trust you? So I mean, one of the points I made was about making the commitment to change, put change into place, and deliver on that commitment. Because this is you're in a position where you have broken the trust of the other party. It's up to you to make that extra, run that extra mile, to make sure that they can rebuild their trust in you. So I'm going to finish up this video with a final infographic which looks back on where I came into this, looking at the concept of professionalism, where professionals practice until they can't get it wrong. And again, we look at these core values of professionalism to include honesty and integrity, which again are 2 of the 7 ISO Halo values. Altruism, this idea that you're not acting just in your own self-interest, that there's a larger dynamic of responsibility that goes with your professional position in society. Respect, and that means that just because you're in a position of power over someone else, or that perhaps they don't have the resources to represent themselves or present themselves adequately, that you do not lose, or that you act in a respectful manner towards them. The concept of responsibility and accountability. And that accountability isn't just on a personal level. It should, and unfortunately in my view doesn't exist among the regulatory bodies, particularly in these areas of professionalism where self-regulation has been the norm for so long. And then in dealing with perhaps issues of conflict, or where there's disagreements, where the issue of apology is arising and people are struggling to work out who's in the wrong or who's responsible, the concept of compassion and empathy, and particularly if you've wronged someone, that you empathize with their position in the process of making that apology, so that there can be some level of authenticity in your offer of apology and your request for forgiveness. And most importantly, that this whole process is meaningful within the concept of dedication and self-improvement. That, again, going back to the quotation that we had earlier, that quotation by Aristotle, that people acquire a particular quality by constantly acting in a particular way. And hopefully this video can act as a reflective piece for both people who are dealing with professionals, or people who are in a conflictual situation where either someone like me has wronged someone else, or that someone else has wronged you, that both parties can, that the wronged person can demand a quality of apology, and that the person who does the wrong sees the act of iterative improvement in themselves by acknowledging and facing up to their wrongdoing and by changing their ways. So once again, as I leave you, I would very much appreciate if you feed comments down on the YouTube channel down below on the process of WWW, what went well, what went wrong, and what would be better. Thank you very much, and see you soon on another segment on the core question of does it matter?